My third observation about stories and storytellers is that stories are told. Indeed, great stories are performed. Let's think about that for a minute. There are many stories we tell ourselves, stories we tell our families. Those are private stories and they're important, but they're not about successful presentation. Successful presentations are public stories. They're rehearsed, they're thought through, they're revised. They involve not just our words, but our bodies. They involve our awareness of our audience and our context and our purpose. So when we think of a successful presentation, we need to think of it as more than just reciting a script or delivering some content. We need to think of it as an entire experience. So in this module, we've talked about the self, and we've talked about the power of fear. We've talked about how we're going to replace that fear with a rule-governed formula, and that by practicing that, we're going to let the self emerge as a public self. As that self emerges, it emerges with energy. And this is what I want to say. Successful presentation is the performance, the public performance of the private self. It's the realization of all the energy that drives us, that makes us individuals, structured through a formula of storytelling that allows us to drive that energy not through fear, but directly to our audiences. In the next video, I'm going to talk about that formula. I'm going to talk about how to structure your energy and your content into a coherent story. But what I want to leave you with is thinking about successful presentation as the public performance of the private self. Onwards. Welcome to Module 2 of Successful Presentation. This module is about the formula. I've been promising the formula throughout the whole first module, and now you're going to learn it. So in Module 1, we talked about three main things. We talked about how fear is very natural and very human, but confuses the issues and causes chaos. So I introduced the Keith Code rule, which is fear inhibits execution. By controlling our fear, we can begin to execute on multiple levels. I then moved to a sense of public speaking as storytelling. And that was important because it suggests that we're going to craft our public speech in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we're going to weave through that a main point that rides along the whole time. Then, finally, I insisted that the storyteller was part of the story. And I think that's important because it means we have to own our work. We can't let the PowerPoint behind us own the work. We can't let the handout in front of us own the work. And we certainly can't try and let someone else's words own our work. So those 3 points were, in a sense, the direction of the whole first module. In the second module, I want to take you through the formula. I'm going to break down every element of the formula into different lessons. The formula is very simple, but it's not easy. This strikes me as a really important point. The formula is simple because it's a very basic structure. It's built on threes: beginning, middle, and end, 3 subpoints under each of those, and maybe 3 subpoints under each of those. And I think in threes, and I built this formula out of threes because I can only remember 3 things at a time. I get worried if there are 4, or if sometimes there's 4 and sometimes there's 6. I get lost in my own mind. So the formula keeps things simple, but it's not easy. It's just a structure for you to concentrate on while you're delivering your speech. And that's so important because it allows you clarity, it allows you not to be afraid, and it allows you to go forward with the next point. Even if the material is complicated, you can rely on the threefold structure to get you through. So the structure works in terms of a 3x3 grid. And in the structure, the beginning is the introduction, the middle is the content, and the ending is the conclusion. And each part of those three pieces has three pieces within it. So the introduction has the salutation, the review of structure, and the one compelling point. The content, which is modular, you could have more modules or fewer, has a topic, it has data, and it has analysis. And finally, the conclusion has a summation, it has a discussion, and in the end, it has a thank you section. Each of the 3x3 points you can remember in your mind like a 3x3 window pane, or like a grid. And in that way, it connects back to Quentin's lessons about the window pane affording clarity, and to Dave's about the organization of the page. But what is so important about the formula is that it's something that allows you to write, to memorize, and to speak. It's a structure so that the page is never blank. You can write introduction and then fill in all the elements. Then you can begin to work with those elements. You can remember, because you always have to think in threes. And finally, when you get very nervous, you can concentrate on it. And you can say, where am I in the structure? I'm now at the conclusion. I can make my way through. 3x3 is simple, but not easy. So I promise you this, the formula works. When that governor's aide came up to me in Beijing and said, you have 2 days to write a presentation, go ahead. First, I was very nervous. I didn't know what I was going to do. But then I said, relax. I took out my little notebook here. Actually, it's this very notebook. Took out this little notebook. I wrote down the formula, introduction, content, conclusion. And then I wrote salutation, and I began. I drafted it, and it worked like magic. Before we get into the formula, I want to pause a bit, and I want to introduce some complexity. Now, I know I like things abstract. If you made it through the first module, you know that. But I know not everybody likes abstraction. Some people do. They like to know, well, where is this getting to? But other people feel, let's keep it simple for now while I get my feet, firmly planted. So appreciating that, I'm going to give you an option here, a choice. If you want, you can go ahead to lesson 3. Watch right through all the videos, put this one on hold, watch all the videos through lesson 3 until we get to the lesson pushing each unit, thinking in circles. So watch all the way up to that one, then come back, watch this, and then watch that. It'll all fall together seamlessly. But if you like abstraction and complexity up front, if you want to know where the whole plot is headed, let's keep watching this one now. So I'll just pause a moment here and I'll have a sip of my coffee while you figure out your strategy. Okay, now, if you're still with me, I want to apologize, but I want you to indulge me even more. I want you to remember I'm an English professor, and I want to give you a little lecture here. So I first started reading, really making books part of my life, when I was a junior in high school. And I grew up in New York City, I remember being in Central Park and discovering 2 authors. One was Jean-Paul Sartre, the great existential thinker, and the other was Raymond Chandler, who was a crime writer of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And Raymond Chandler, he's a very amazing writer. He started writing cheap, what was called pulp fiction, because it was printed on such cheap paper. And he went on to become a major American author. He really went beyond crime to discover a voice, and he created a great character, Philip Marlowe, the hard-boiled detective, played wonderfully in the movies by Humphrey Bogart. So Chandler's stories were collected in a book called Trouble Is My Business. And this book has about 5 stories. They're really readable. And it has an introduction that he wrote about looking back and thinking about how he was learning his craft. And I find that introduction really important to understanding, in plain speech, how a writer learns to write, and for our purposes, how a presenter learns to present. So I have it up online. I want you now to take a minute, download it or get it up on your screen. Go on, take a minute, and I'll wait. Another sip of coffee for me. Did you get it? Okay, good. So I have it here, and I'm going to read a section of it to you, and I'm going to have to put on my magic glasses again. Here we go. So, I typed up 3 of the paragraphs from the introduction. The introduction's about 20 pages or so, and I typed up 3 paragraphs. I'm only going to read to you the paragraph in bold. So, if you'll follow along, we can read together. This is Raymond Chandler writing in 1950 about his stories from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, really the 30s. He writes, "As I look back on my stories, it would be absurd if I did not wish they had been better. But if they had been much better, they would have not been published. If the formula had been a little less rigid, more of the writing of that time might have survived. Some of us tried pretty hard to break out of the formula, but we usually got caught and sent back. To exceed the limits of a formula without destroying it is the dream of every magazine writer who is not a hopeless hack. There are things in my stories which I might like to change or leave out altogether. To do this may look simple, but if you try, you find you cannot do it at all. You will only destroy what is good without having any noticeable effect on what is bad. You cannot recapture the mood, the state of innocence, much less the animal gusto you had when you had very little else. Everything a writer learned about the art or craft of fiction takes just a little away from his need or desire to write it all. In the end, he knows all the tricks and has nothing to say." I love that passage. Now, Chandler's a writer, and he's talking about the formula for crime writing. You're going to be a successful presenter, and you're thinking about Cuskin's formula for presentation. So they're 2 different things, but what he says is important. It gives us a lot of insight. The first thing he says is he would wish he was better. Everybody wants to be better. Again, that point of self-judgment. We all know what we could be if only we were a little better. But that's okay, because he's a genius and he wishes he was better, so we'll do our best. Everyone, it's human to wish you're better. Second, and underline this line, he says, to exceed the limits of a formula without destroying it is the dream of every magazine writer who is not a hopeless hack. Everyone works with a formula. Shakespeare works with a formula. He has a formula. In Shakespeare's case, it's the formula for comedy or for tragedy. But everybody tries to exceed that formula. Push it a little bit more. Push it. You can't destroy it. If you destroy it, you're no longer playing the game. You're outside doing your own thing and no one wants to hear you. But if you flex that formula, you can come up with something brilliant. And people will understand it because they too know the formula. The formula's there for a reason. But if you push it, you can be tremendously creative. And then he says that to go back would be wrong because at the very moment when he wrote, there was a mood, there was a state of innocence, there was animal gusto. So what he's saying is that writing itself is like a performance. Successful presentation is a performance too. The point is, nothing is perfect. The perfect formula would be wooden. It would be nothing but the tricks of the trade. What you really want is to push the formula, to bend it, to inflect it, to make it your own. So in that case, again, the words don't matter so much. The content, it doesn't need to be overwhelmingly detailed. What matters is that you use the formula, but you exceed it to capture who you are, to capture the mood, the state of innocence, and the gusto. So this brings us to Cuskin best practice number 7. And that is the secret ingredient to the formula is creativity. Creativity is not magic. Creativity is simply pushing the formula without destroying it. Creativity is capturing the moment when we're all in the room together and we're all at a moment and people are following that presentation and they're believing in it because they trust you and you push them one extra step and they were there with you and maybe you could never do it again. The secret ingredient is discovering that moment. That discovery is you. So I've been talking about that the secret ingredient is creativity. But what is creativity? How do you guys think about creativity?
Well, this gets back to probably how disciplined I like to be with things, but I think that this idea of just wild creativity for creativity's sake is actually can be very non-productive. You have to have a basis in some discipline and process first.
My experience in working with students on creative projects was that they tend to think it's like the muse coming to pay them a visit.
Yeah.
And that's very unreliable and it's really fickle. It's always based, to my way of thinking, in process. I have a problem, that it's a design problem. I want to be creative, I want to do beautiful work, but I don't wait for great ideas to come because they typically don't. What I need to do is start with list making and understanding the problem at hand and starting to work within a process. That's what my design course is about, is talking about that process and understanding our palette and the blank canvas. We can go to work right away, do creative work, but working within parameters.
But I don't understand, or let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. If it's entirely mechanical list making, where does how do you be original in a list?
It shows up. It simply shows up. If you don't start with some type of process, you don't know if it's going to show up or not.
By saying it simply shows up sounds like, you know, Dave Underwood happens to be a really creative guy, and it's going to show up. Well, I mean, what do you think? How do we get to some sense of when you're creative?
Right. And this is a really interesting question because this is very hard. And I would think of myself as a pretty creative person. And I think about how I teach literature and how I teach my students to be creative with their intellectual process. And a lot of times it's about juxtaposing two things that you don't think are related, or three things: writing, design, and presentation. And you juxtapose them and you look for the similarities, and all of a sudden these relationships begin to come out that you didn't see before. And that's the moment of creativity. But expressing them with some discipline, I think, is really important because otherwise you can't get your ideas across to your audience.
I like to push the idea of process and having a formula because so many people tell themselves they can't design because I'm not creative. And that's I think why I've really adopted this style of teaching design, is because we're all more creative than we give ourselves credit for. We just don't understand the process. It's like, give a guitar to someone who's never played guitar. Well, they'll be creative, but it's unlistenable.
Well, then how do you know when you're unlistenable, when your website is awful, you think you've been creative,
right,
or you think your sentences are really smart because they have a lot of adjectives, and that's indicating that you're creative.
Yeah,
how do you know? How do you know? We've talked about fear and self-censoring. How do you know when you should self-censor yourself because you're not being creative, you're being vulgar, and how do you know when you're really being creative?
Time and distance. And a second pair of eyes.
I was going to come back to that.
And learning to be a critical viewer.
Yeah.
I think if I were to show you guys a blog designer, a web designer, an ad for a magazine that was really awful, you would know it. And when I teach graphic design at Boulder County Jail, my students can see bad design immediately. But when it's their own work, they have a harder time. And I think it's learning to see your work in the broader context of design.
In a way, I want to come back to the watchwords of this specialization: clarity, structure, revision. And I think that our discussion of creativity has hit all those things. That if you look at a piece, a website, and you ask yourself, is this clear? Well, then you know it's not really creative. And what Dave was saying about getting some distance and time is really the process of revision. And that's what leads to an understanding of whether you're saying something in an interesting way or not. But it's also what you said about process in the very beginning, that if you don't master the structure, if you don't understand the structure, if you don't understand some of the problems behind what you're trying to solve, then really how can you make anything that's not just a mishmash?
And how can you repeat success?
I think that's a really critical point.
You know, you may stumble across something that's good.
Once.
That you're proud of.
Yeah.
But if you have to do it again next Wednesday, you better have a process in place. And that's what all designers understand. You know, that's foundational to being a good designer is process.
The thing about creativity is it's not magic. It's not just inspiration. It has to do with process. It has to do with self-reflection, with revision, and with understanding why you're trying to communicate what you're communicating. Welcome to Lesson 2. In this lesson, I'm going to focus on the introduction. Now, the introduction has 3 points: the salutation, the review of the structure, and the one compelling point. I'm going to break down each of these points and go over them in some detail. But here, I want to cover why the introduction is important. The introduction is important because it's the very beginning. That sounds obvious, but let's think about the consequences of that for a minute. The very beginning of your talk is where you're most nervous. It's that moment when your adrenaline is kicking in and you question yourself whether you can go on and give a successful presentation. It's at that moment that you need a strong structure to guide you through. You need to have this structure in your mind, and you need to gain purchase on the entire room. So if you are nervous, you need to own the room. You need to establish yourself as the storyteller, the trusted leader who is going to lead people through a story. And that means you also have to lay out your story, your review of the structure, and the story's moral, its meaning, the one compelling point. So you have your nerves, but you're going to rely on a structure. You're going to establish yourself as a storyteller. You're going to move through beginning, middle, and end, and you're going to tie up your one compelling point. It's very important that you learn your introduction, even if you don't have a lot of time. In this video, I'd like to talk about the very first part of the introduction, the salutation. Now, according to our 3x3 grid, the salutation has 3 parts: the welcome, the chance for you to introduce yourself, and the acknowledgments. The salutation is so important because it sets the tone for your entire presentation. It's the place where you meet your audience and they meet you. It's a kind of almost magical moment where a relationship, indeed a community, is formed. So even if your job is simply to stand up and turn on a video, do not forfeit this opportunity. Do not give up the chance to build community from the very start. So let's break down these 3 roles: welcome, introduction, acknowledgement. The welcome is literally the most formulaic part of the whole formula. It is simply where you walk on stage and you welcome the audience to your presentation, you give the title, and then you thank them. You thank them for coming. You just offer them thanks for coming out on a beautiful summer day and being willing to spend it with you, or for making their way through a snowstorm to listen to your talk. Just thank them. Set out the tone. Then introduce yourself. This is very important. You have to tell them why you are speaking to them in the context that you are. There are many contexts, and there's many good reasons to speak for them. It's not a very long explanation. Just tell them who you are. Then acknowledge them. This is critical. Now, in the course of my lectures, I'm going to tell you, or encourage you at least, to memorize your lectures. But in this one instance, I'm going to suggest that you be very careful with your words and perhaps draw a piece of paper and read. Why? Because when you acknowledge people, you need to get their names and their titles correctly. You need to accurately acknowledge. This is very important. And if you pass over the acknowledgments, you may later find that someone's feelings were hurt or that they're somewhat upset with you. I've been down this road. Always take the time to acknowledge. People like to be acknowledged, even if they seem embarrassed, and even if they say, oh no, I did nothing. They'll be very proud if their work is recognized. So take the time to acknowledge. What I'm saying overall is this opening section seems like barely part of a talk, barely part of a presentation, but in fact, it sets the tone for community. It establishes you as a leader among a group of people. And those people are various. They don't necessarily have to follow you. But if you do not make a community out of them, it will be a long uphill climb with a group of strangers. Do you want that? So, the tone in the very beginning is very important. And if I may, I would suggest that that tone be warm and generous. Thank them, acknowledge them, welcome them. Be warm. Why not? Smile. Smiling literally lifts you up. But there's a trick to generosity. Generosity appears to be that you are giving something away, but really they are giving everything away. By being generous, you actually lose nothing. And instead, they gain something, they gain the acknowledgement of your speech, but really they give you their ear. They allow you to lead. Generosity is a trick, because if Santa can give his toys away, it certainly stands to reason that he owns a lot of toys to begin with. Generosity appears to weaken your authority, but it actually allows you to seize authority, to become the leader, to become the person who can give acknowledgement or deny acknowledgement. And that's a very powerful position. So, by being generous, by being warm, you can establish yourself. You can establish the trust and sincerity of the community. And from trust and sincerity come your authority to speak. The second part of the introduction is the review of the structure. This is a really simple thing, but for some reason, people always forget to review the structure of their talk. They think it's not important, or they think maybe they'll review something else. I have this graduate student I'm working with right now, and he's a very smart guy, but he never tells me in his introduction what's coming in the essay. The result is that reading his writing is like wandering through a dark dungeon. Sometimes I stumble across a box of gems, and that's great, but I never know what's coming, and I never know where I am, and I never know where it's leading. As a result, my mind begins to wander. I begin to come up with my own ideas and make my own connections, and ultimately, I start writing his essay according to the way I like it in my head. This isn't what you want in your talk. What you want is people to know where they're going. They want to know what the beginning is, the middle is, and the ending is. And they won't know unless you tell them. So take the time in the middle of your introduction to say, in this talk, I'm going to, then I'm going to, and then when I conclude, I'm going to. This will make your listeners see where we're going. They'll feel confident and safe. They'll feel secure. They'll feel that you're the leader leading them along a path. Your talk has one compelling point. But that's not true. I'm the CFO of a major corporation. 10 units, each composed of 100 people, report to me. I've got to talk for 4 hours presenting my whole company. I don't have one point. I have 500 points. Putting aside the point that any talk longer than 20 minutes is trouble, Cuskin Best Practices number 8 is that your talk only has one compelling point. But how can that be? Maybe it's true. Maybe you are that CFO. The reason your talk only has one compelling point is because people can only take in so much information in oral delivery. Again, you could give your listeners, your audience, a laminate card. You could write them a letter. You could present them with the spreadsheet for them to study. You could do all this and go have a glass of wine on your own time. The point is, when you stand up to talk, you've got to establish the common denominator that dominates all of those separate points. You cannot hold 500 points or even 10 points as equal. You have to funnel them down to one compelling point, and you have to present that point at the beginning of your talk. And the reason you have to do it this way is because you have to focus your listeners at the end of your introduction on what you want them to walk away with. If you don't, they'll walk away with whatever they take and whatever they remember, and you've lost control of your presentation. So stop and think about that common denominator. If you are that CFO with many different points, take the time to focus, to weed through the points and find out which one, figure out in your mind which one is the important one. And let me tell you this, if you sit and think about it and you add up all those hundreds of points and you condense them down to one compelling point, and you get up and in the first 4 minutes of your talk, you deliver that one compelling point to your audience and they get it, well, then you've done it. Then you've done it. The rest is downhill. If a cell phone goes off or if there's a fire alarm, you've delivered your one point and the audience knows it. You've pushed the boundaries, you've been creative, and you've accomplished your goal. For all you care, the talk is over, and you can comport yourself with that attitude, because delivering the one compelling point at the end of the introduction is all you have to do. Now we can stand back a bit and look at the whole introduction. We can see that it's really a 3x3 grid. It starts with the salutation, which has the welcome, the place where you introduce yourself, and the acknowledgments. It moves on to the review of the structure, which simply covers the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then it hits the one compelling point, which in itself has the setup for the one compelling point. Then it says the point, and then it tells them why that point is important. That's the formula for the introduction.
All right, so you've been working on your slides. I've done a memo with some of my students' helps, and now it's your turn to begin working on your presentation. So what are you thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question, Quentin. I've been thinking about it. And actually what I'm thinking is a combo. I'd like a visual behind me as I present, something that expresses effective communication, not just as a concept, but as our course. Also, what I'm thinking is what I really need help with, Dave, is a visual, a handout, something that I can give to people that expresses all the things we've been talking about, that the course moves from writing to design to a synthetic sense of public speaking. I need that on a piece of paper, and I need it, Dave, with pizzazz so that I can refer to it as I'm going. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. It needs to be informative. It needs to reflect your personal brand. It needs to have continuity with our other materials. It needs to be professional and clear.
That's great. You know, I have a good sense for what I want to do here. Is there anything that you guys want to see out of the presentation?
Sell Coursera.
Sell Coursera.
Convince them on the bigger themes of this course and why it's so valuable to our students and our belief in what we're doing.
Okay, after this, I'm going home and working on it.
Great.
Welcome to Lesson 3, the Modular Content Unit. In the last lesson, we talked about the steps of the introduction. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the 3 steps of the Modular Content Unit. The important point is while the introduction is singular, the Modular Content Unit can be repeated, mixed and matched throughout your talk. The only rule is the Modular Content Units have to plug back in to the one compelling point. So let me say this. I'm a big proponent of short talks. And I say that because I believe no one in the world ever said, I wish that talk was a lot longer. But I acknowledge that some talks have to cover the content, and sometimes content involves a lot of details. So what I want to suggest is that each modular content unit has three parts: the topic, the data itself, and then the analysis. And those three parts plug in together to be a full unit. That full unit can be moved around in your structure. You can eliminate it if you have to, or you can replicate it if you have to present more data. The one point is, each unit has to make sense in terms of your one compelling point. They can't all be level. The one compelling point is what you're trying to communicate through all these modular content units. In the last video, I introduced the notion of the modular content unit having three main parts: the topic, the data, and the analysis. In this video, I want to explain how the modular content unit locks in and becomes really a unit greater than the sum of its parts. So the way I think about it is the modular content unit needs to have an almost circular nature. That is, the data is just raw. It doesn't really present itself. You need to present that data, but in presenting it, you need to explain to your audience where you're going. So, in that way, your data has your analysis, but your analysis needs to be forecast by your topic itself. And your topic needs to reach back around to your data so that it's a circle together. If your topic only introduces your data, your audience will get lost. They won't get the full picture. Instead, your topic needs to introduce your data, but it needs to forecast where you're going with your analysis. In a way, this reminds me of what Raymond Chandler was talking about in Trouble Is My Business, because Raymond Chandler suggested that there was a formula. In this case, topic, data, analysis. But he also said you have to exceed that formula. You have to go beyond it so that really you create a fourth term. That fourth term I call the keyword, and it stems from pushing your analysis to a bigger conceptual idea. And once you get that bigger conceptual idea, you own that unit because the conceptual idea grows out of your analysis. It's larger, so it allows you to come back and revise your topic. The keyword becomes the dominant concept that pulls together the whole content unit. So what I'm suggesting is that when I started this talk, my data was really just the 3 points: topic, data, and analysis. But I pushed my thinking so that I came up with the notion of the circle, then I came up with the notion of the keyword, and then I came up with the notion of locks in. But then, if my video has worked correctly, I promoted locks in to the very beginning, and locks in became the concept that I was trying to communicate to you. Indeed, in my mind, all I thought about was locks in, circle, Raymond Chandler, and then conclusion. That was the structure. And you'll notice it wasn't a 3-point structure, it was a 4-point structure because I pushed myself to the end. I pushed myself to a final point reflecting on my own process to communicate to you how it worked. A really hungry person will push him or herself to that 4th point every time. In the last video, I got to the point of explaining the modular content unit as dependent on a 4th term, the keyword that both governs it and comes back and defines the topic itself. But this is a little confusing because all along I've been insisting that my rule-governed formula works through threes, a grid of 3 by 3 by 3. And now I'm suggesting it actually contains within it a 4th. So let me talk about this for a minute. The modular content unit, it's a sandwich. It's a sandwich in which the topic and the analysis holds the data. But for it to be more than just a sandwich, a sum greater than its parts. It's got to add up to a final statement. And that final statement is the key word, the fourth term that allows you to define the whole idea. And once you've defined that whole idea, you can control it in your mind. You can juggle it as you speak. You can move concepts around. You can eliminate them when the audience appears to lag. You can pick up and move more quickly through them all because you've memorized those keywords. The reasons the keywords are important is to identify the concepts, and the reason the concepts are important is because they pin down the content. Owning them will allow you to move swiftly. So I have a metaphor here. My metaphor is the stick-shift automobile. Now, I know many of my viewers probably don't drive stick-shift. Indeed, in the days of self-driving cars, we're not even going to drive at all. But old school, I like to drive stick-shift. Now, the reason a stick-shift works is that you move between gears. You choose which gear depending on how fast you're going. Now, anybody who's ridden with somebody driving a stick shift, who's just learning, knows when they botch the shift because your neck snaps back and the gears grind. So you can be driving along and all of a sudden, the trick of driving a stick shift and the trick of giving a good talk is smoothness. Nobody ever knows when you're shifting from modular content unit to modular content unit. So a great stick shift driver, he or she can just be driving along and you don't even realize when they've gotten out of first. And you don't even realize that they've skipped third and jumped right to fourth from second because they're really speeding up. And you might not even know when they double downshift back down to second to take a curve. All you know is the car's moving along nicely. This is the trick. Conclude each unit strongly so you can transition to the next smoothly. You're going to conclude each unit by emphasizing that keyword because the more you push that keyword, the more you launch yourself into the next modular content unit. The stronger you shift, the stronger and smoother your transition. So in this module, I've talked a lot about pushing your ideas, about pushing yourself. I've introduced the kind of Kuskin's conception that 3 points are easy to organize, but then I've also said that you have to get beyond that third point. You have to push yourself to a fourth point that sums everything up. That fourth point I've talked about as a key word. I've talked about as really expressing the sum that's greater than the 3 parts. So what I want to ask you guys is, how do you know when enough is enough? How do you know when you've pushed yourself to an effective, smart statement? And how do you know when you have to keep pushing?
Wow, I think that is a really tough question. I think ultimately it comes from the process of revision and thinking about what you're doing and what your purpose is and understanding what your purpose is. And then at some point, it's a leap of faith, isn't it? You say, I have put in enough work. This is exactly what I want to say, and I'm going to try it. And I think there's more than one answer often, and you have to choose one and commit.
And I hate to say it, but there's something, it involves the gut, unfortunately. But that's a lot of what it is. It's that nagging feeling that you've done something, maybe you even, in my case, handed it to a client, but there's this nagging feeling that it could be better. And that's a hard thing to teach and a hard thing to understand. The only thing I can say again, and I talk about this a lot with design, is time and distance.
Yeah.
Looking at it, if you have the luxury 2 or 3 days later and seeing, does it still look great? And distance, and in a designer's case, a second or third pair of eyes, somebody else to look at.
Well, I often say too, that's what deadlines are for. You're done when the deadline approaches. Otherwise, you could tinker with things forever.
Tinker with things forever.
Yeah.
I talk about it in terms of locking in. That I find that when I push myself to a certain point, the whole thing, those Kuskin 3 points, locks in with the fourth point, and it feels like a whole. It feels like a piece. And I know I've gotten somewhere that's at the deadline. That like this has achieved its deadline. It's done. It's cooked. And I guess I was wanting to ask you, Quentin, because I know you do martial arts, and how do you know you can never train enough, right?
No,
But
never,
how do you know
right.
when you've gotten to a point where you feel confident?
Well, I think part of the process of being excellent at what you do is never feeling totally confident and always working and pushing.
But that makes me afraid, because then I feel like I'm never good enough, right? I'm never good enough to walk out on the mat. I'm never good enough to walk out on the stage. So how do you balance that in your own head?
Oh, well, preparation, right? I think training and practicing, in our case, in our courses, it's revision and putting in the discipline and putting in the work. I mean, I know, for instance, if I go to a karate tournament and I haven't had as much time to train, maybe I've been injured or something like that, I walk out onto the mat and I know I'm not ready, and that affects my performance every time. You know, I find myself trying to fake my way through it, whereas if I've had time to prepare, and you always feel like, I could have prepared a little bit more. You have to get comfortable with that sense of unsurety. But if I have put in my time, I can walk on the mat, I can deal with my adrenaline, and I can deliver. So I really think that part of it is really key.
We are up to the last lesson in the formula, the conclusion. Now, if you've been following me, I think you can see that because I stress the one compelling point in the beginning of the talk, the conclusion doesn't carry quite as much weight as necessary. And that's for a reason. The reason is, I think that if you get your audience to buy in to the one compelling point, you inform them what it is, and you get them to subscribe to it, then they can begin to fold all your additional modular content units in. And they can think, oh, that makes sense because I know where we're going. And then, if you run out of time, or if you get interrupted and you don't get all your content in, and maybe you don't even have time for the conclusion, it's all right. Because the whole talk is a circle. From the beginning, you forecast where you're going at the end. And the only way you've been able to do that is by knowing at the end where you are and building that to the beginning, building it into the review of the structure and building it into the one compelling point. But nevertheless, all talks conclude. And if you've done things right and weighed your time out, counted things out so everything makes sense, then you'll get to a conclusion. And your conclusion should have, and you know this, 3 points. It should have a summary, a place where you say, in sum, I've covered, and then you lay out the things you've covered. Or you can say, in conclusion, this talk has been about. And then after that, it should have a discussion. And the discussion is important because what would be ideal is that you give your audience something to think about. Something so, if there's a Q&A session, a listener could ask the question, pursue that question. And if you were smart, you seed into the discussion the questions you want to pursue. But maybe there's not a Q&A period. Maybe you just like to have your audience think about something. Maybe when they drive home, they're still thinking about it. And that's good because they're thinking about your points and your talk. Lastly, you have to thank your audience. They've suffered through your talk, and you need to thank them for doing so. That closes the loop and closes out the community. If there's any trick to a conclusion, it's sincerity. This may sound like a bit of a lie, but if you can sound really sincere when you pose those discussion questions, then you can really win your audience over. Because all of a sudden they feel like they've been a part of the central issues from the start. I'll tell you, here at the University of Colorado Boulder, there is a truly great teacher. He's just retired and he's still teaching a few classes. He's probably the best and the most popular teacher I've ever met. And I've sat in on a lot of his courses in order to learn his techniques. And what I have learned is that even if he teaches the same thing over and over and over, he asks questions with a sincerity that makes you believe this is the first time he's ever taught this. So, I leave you with this notion of sincerity. It's part of the whole relationship of welcoming, of warmth, of generosity, of trust, and ultimately of authority. If you are sincere and you deliver your points with sincerity, no matter how many times you've delivered them before, you will build your audience not against you, but with you. They will suddenly become a part of your presentation and a part of your mission. They will go beyond as members of your community. They will go beyond you, and they will deliver your talk beyond your voice. We've finally gotten the entire formula out. I want to pause now and have a moment to think about the formula. So, as I mentioned earlier, I had Dave construct the formula as how I imagine it, and I think he captured it pretty well. It's in a PDF, and you can download it. And actually, I'm going to have a sip of coffee while I wait for you to do so. Okay, you have that formula? I actually printed out a copy of my own here. I want us just to pause and look at it a bit. Maybe even mark it up, take some notes, and think about how this formula works. Now, it's printed very small in Dave's handout, so I'm going to need my magic glasses. Ah, there it is. So the governing concept of the formula really lies with its circular nature. And we can see that nature in a couple different ways. I mean, the formula is still a story. It still starts with a beginning, it moves through a middle, and it gets to an end. But it's a story where the punchline is told in the very beginning. It's not a story of surprise, it's a story of a journey that unfolds and that we know where we're going at the end. So the first thing about the circular nature is that the beginning predicts the very ending, and the ending is anticipated by the beginning. So what does this mean? This means, on the one hand, that because the one compelling point is up front, it means that your audience is going to feel secure. They're going to understand where they're going. And you can really emphasize that first point. You can really push it. You can really bring urgency and passion to that first point, because it's important that they hear it, because you want to get it into their mind so that as you begin to unfold your modular content units, as the details come out, and as you push them, they're still thinking of that first main point. So the trick of the modular content units is that they're endlessly expandable. They're like gears in the car where you can smoothly go, and if you push a little on the gas to get into that next gear, it'll lead the talk forward. It'll give us a forward movement, some power with each shift. But you might also think of those modular content units like train cars in a long freight train, each coupled around a keyword strongly. That keyword allows us to carry over, pulling the next one along. You emphasize the keyword here, and then you link it to the next, and it pulls us along. In that way, the talk has a kind of flexibility, because train cars or gears can be skipped, and you can make other attachments through keywords, or they can be expanded. And that's important, because you're going to remember those keywords. You're going to remember them and use them in your mind to make those links. But overall, the importance of a circle cannot be underestimated, because there's a kind of paradox in that circle. And I know I've emphasized paradox before, but remember, a paradox are two statements that are nevertheless true, but are in self-contradiction. So the paradox here is that you're going to begin with the one compelling point, but the one compelling point is where you get to at the end. The beginning and the ending are the same. And that's hard to realize, because really, when you start working on your talk, you don't know what that one compelling point is. So the whole point of what I am teaching you in this circular fashion is that you have to begin by using the formula, aligning your modular content units, coming to the common denominator, writing that as your conclusion, but then coming back and pushing yourself to include that in your introduction, explaining the beginning, middle, and end, and then presenting that one compelling point in the introduction. This is very important, and it brings us back to the notion that the formula is simple. 3 by 3 by 3 by 3, we march along. But it's not easy, because it asks you to push yourself to get to the end and come back to the beginning and master it. That's important, because it hits again at the notion that we are all afraid of presenting in public. We all want to be brilliant. We all want to stand on that stage or stand before a boardroom and make a brilliant point. But the weight of that challenge is often crippling. It's overwhelming. It freezes us up. We don't know where to start. So start simple with the formula. Write in, "Welcome to my talk," and go from there. Add up your points and then push them. Push them to keywords. Collect the keywords in your mind and push yourself there to come to that one compelling point, and push yourself one step further so that the one compelling point is up in your introduction and the whole talk from start to finish locks in. You are going to be brilliant. You are going to deliver a successful presentation that marks you as brilliant, as special, as unique. But you're not going to do it by magic. You're not going to do it by just waking up one morning and walking in and being brilliant. You're going to do it by pushing yourself, by pushing each point a little further, and by coming back and revising that introduction so it anticipates that one point and puts it out. We can all be brilliant because we can all push ourselves a little further. Onwards.